On May 6, 1982, a Learjet carrying a fugitive heroin trafficker fell out of clear sky into the Atlantic Ocean, 12 miles off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, and everyone aboard died. The man's name was Salvatore Ruggiero. His wife, Stephanie, was beside him. Two pilots were at the controls. The aircraft, a Gates Learjet 23 with a federal registration number, had departed Teterboro, New Jersey, that morning under conditions the aviation authorities would later describe as favorable for flight, and at some point during the journey it descended without explanation from cruise altitude into the water. There was no distress call. There was no explosion. No communication of any kind from the cockpit after the initial phase of the flight. When divers reached the wreckage, scattered across 75 feet of ocean floor and 55 feet of water, they found something that the dead man's associates had hoped no one would ever see. A quantity of heroin, packed for transport, sitting among the twisted aluminum and salt water of a private jet that a fugitive from 3 federal indictments had been using to move between the lives he was living and the one he was running from. The man who died in the water was an associate of the Gambino crime family, the younger brother of one of John Gotti's closest soldiers, and the operator of a multimillion-dollar heroin importation ring that violated the single most important rule the boss of the family had ever issued. His death, on its own, should have been the end of a chapter. Instead, it was the beginning of the end of everything. What happened next, because his brother Angelo could not stop talking about the dead man's business, is the story of how the entire Gotti crew was destroyed. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to a house on Long Island where the FBI was already listening. The National Transportation Safety Board would conclude months later that the aircraft had experienced an uncontrolled descent from cruise altitude for undetermined reasons. No evidence of mechanical failure was identified. No evidence of sabotage. No evidence of pilot error. No explosion. No fire. No structural compromise before the moment of impact. The cause of the crash was listed as undetermined and has never been officially resolved. The wreckage showed no signs of any event that aviation investigators could point to and say, "This is why the plane fell." It simply descended at some point between Teterboro and the Florida coast, from the altitude at which a Learjet was supposed to fly, and it struck the surface of the Atlantic and killed everyone inside. The investigation would produce a final report that answered every question except the one that mattered. The wreckage was mapped and cataloged. The flight path was reconstructed from available radar data. The weather conditions were confirmed as clear, with visibility that should have presented no hazard to an experienced pilot at any altitude. The aircraft's maintenance history was reviewed. The pilot's qualifications were examined. None of it explained what happened between the departure from Teterboro and the moment the aircraft entered the water off the Georgia coast. The crash simply occurred in the way that certain events occur at the intersection of physics and probability, without offering the living any insight into the mechanism that produced them. What was determined, immediately and without ambiguity, was the identity of the man aboard. Salvatore Frank Ruggiero, born July 20th, 1945, in East New York, Brooklyn. Fugitive, heroin trafficker, the ringleader of what federal investigators called the Pleasant Avenue Connection, a narcotics distribution network based in the Italian-American enclave of East Harlem that would later be recognized as a precursor to the massive pizza connection drug smuggling operation. 3 federal indictments had been filed against him, charging extortion, tax evasion, and narcotics trafficking. He had been running from those charges for years, living under assumed names in hideouts across multiple states. His wife, Stephanie, a former airline stewardess, died beside him. His body was recovered on May 14th, more than a week after the crash, identified and pulled from the water while the investigation into the wreckage continued. Within hours of the notification, 3 men drove to a house in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey, that Salvatore had been using as a fugitive hideout. The 3 men were Angelo Ruggiero, Salvatore's older brother and a soldier in the Gambino crime family; John Gotti, the younger brother of John Gotti, and John Caniglia, another member of the crew that operated out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. They were not there to grieve. They were there to find the heroin and the cash they knew Salvatore had stored in the house, the unsold inventory of a dead man's narcotics enterprise. A memorial service would follow at their mother's home in Howard Beach, Queens. Angelo would later say, on a phone he did not know was being recorded, that his brother had a pretty good, nice send-off, that the whole family and all the wise guys in the Gambino crime family had been there. The grief was real. The urgency to recover the drugs was equally real. The two impulses existed in the same moment, in the same men, without contradiction, because in the world they inhabited, mourning and operational necessity were never mutually exclusive. The FBI's Gambino squad, headed by Special Agent Bruce Mao, had been investigating Salvatore's drug network for months before the Learjet fell from the sky, and the crash did not close the investigation. It opened a new one. The agents who had been tracking the dead man's movements and supply lines now turned their attention to the men who had inherited his business, and the man at the center of that inheritance, the dead man's brother, had a problem that Salvatore had never had. Angelo Ruggiero could not keep his mouth shut. The investigation that had been aimed at the man in the water was now aimed at the man on the shore, and the man on the shore had no idea that agents were already preparing to enter his walls. Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti had known each other since they were boys in East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood in the 1940s and 1950s where the boundaries between legitimate life and criminal enterprise were not always boundaries that anyone in the community maintained. Both were born in 1940. Both grew up in working-class Italian-American households in a part of the city that had produced organized crime figures for generations. Both were drawn by proximity and temperament into the orbit of the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a street gang with direct connections to local Mafia figures, where they also met a third boy named Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson. Johnson was half Italian and half Native American, a distinction that would prevent him from ever being inducted as a full member of the organization he served, and that humiliation would eventually drive him to become the most consequential informant in the history of the Gambino crime family. By the time Ruggiero and Gotti were teenagers, both had accumulated arrest records that documented a shared trajectory into professional criminality, street fighting, car theft, public intoxication, bookmaking, possession of illegal firearms, burglary. Angelo was a high school dropout with no interest in legitimate employment and no visible aptitude for it. His mother, Mary Della Croce, was the biological sister of Aniello Neal Della Croce, a man who had risen through the ranks of the Gambino crime family to become its underboss, first serving under Carlo Gambino himself, and then, with visible reluctance, continuing in the same position under Gambino's chosen successor, Paul Castellano. The family connection gave Angelo a direct path into the organizational hierarchy, though Della Croce was widely understood to be far closer to Gotti than to his own nephew. Angelo's personality made the imbalance understandable. Law enforcement authorities described Ruggiero as a stocky man with a gravelly voice that sounded, in their characterization, like a cement truck mixer, a condition produced by decades of smoking 4 packs of Marlboro cigarettes every single day. His nickname was Quack Quack, earned not for any speech impediment, but for his compulsive, unrelenting, seemingly biological need to talk. He talked to associates. He talked to visitors. He talked on the telephone. He talked in rooms where sensitive business was being discussed, and in rooms where nothing of importance was happening. He talked about drug deals, loan sharking, gambling operations, contract killings, and his personal opinions of every figure in the Gambino family hierarchy. John Caniglia, who had worked beside him for years and understood the liability his voice represented, reportedly observed that you could dial any 7 numbers and there was a 50-50 chance that Angelo would answer the phone. The observation was intended as criticism. It was also, as events would demonstrate, an understatement. Both men joined the crew of Cap Regime Carmine Fatico, who operated out of a storefront in Ozone Park, and controlled a portfolio of criminal enterprises that ranged across Queens, Brooklyn, and the cargo terminals of what was then called Idlewild Airport, later renamed John F. Kennedy International. The airport was a particular focus. Trucks loaded with merchandise moved through the facility's service roads at all hours, and the crews that hijacked them operated with a regularity that treated the theft of commercial cargo as a daily occupation rather than an occasional crime. Gotti and Ruggiero learned their trade at the airport, identifying vulnerable shipments, coordinating the interception, and disposing of the stolen goods through a network of fences that Fatico's crew had maintained for years. In 1966, Gotti was injured attempting to steal a cement mixer from a construction site when the equipment fell and crushed his toes, leaving him with a permanent limp. In 1968, both Gotti and Ruggiero were convicted of hijacking cargo and received 3-year sentences in federal prison. They served their time, emerged with the organizational credibility that a prison sentence conferred in their world, and resumed operations. The event that elevated both men from ordinary street criminals to figures of organizational significance occurred on May 22, 1973. Carlo Gambino's nephew, Emmanuel Gambino, had been kidnapped and murdered by an Irish-American gangster named James McBratney, and the family wanted the debt collected in the most permanent form available. Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, and a Gambino associate named Ralph Gallioni were assigned to the hit. They tracked McBratney to Snoop's Bar and Grill on Staten Island. When McBratney refused to leave with them, they shot him where he stood. Gallioni fired the fatal rounds. All 3 men fled the scene but were subsequently identified and arrested. Ruggiero and Gotti were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison terms. They were paroled in July of 1977. The killing had served its purpose. It had demonstrated to the leadership of the Gambino family that these 2 men from the Fatico crew were willing to do what was asked of them, without hesitation and at personal risk, and that willingness was the currency that purchased advancement. Upon their release, Joseph N. Gallo and Agnello Della Croce formally inducted Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti into the Gambino crime family as made men in a ceremony that carried the weight of an oath sworn in blood. The inductions were widely attributed to Della Croce's influence as underboss and his particular investment in Gotti's future. Angelo's induction rode on the same current, a benefit of proximity to the man Della Croce favored most. The Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, became the headquarters of the crew's operations. The club was a nondescript storefront, indistinguishable from any other social club on the block, but the men who entered and exited its doors were running criminal enterprises that generated annual revenues exceeding $1 million by the late 1970s. Gotti served as the captain, the man who gave the orders and received the profits. Angelo was his closest friend and most loyal soldier, present at every meeting, involved in every decision, and critically, talking about every detail to anyone who would listen. Gene Gotti, John's younger brother, born in 1946, operated as a trusted earner and enforcer within the inner circle. John Carneglia, born May 21, 1945, in Ozone Park, provided the muscle, the logistical capacity, and the operational discipline the crew required. The 4 of them, Gotti, Ruggiero, Gene, and Carneglia, formed the core of what the FBI would come to call the Bergin crew, and their operations encompassed gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, extortion, and, in violation of the single most important directive their organization had ever issued, heroin trafficking. The man who had issued that directive presided over the Gambino family from an address that reflected his conception of power. Paul Castellano, who had succeeded his brother-in-law Carlo Gambino as boss in 1976, lived in a 33,000 square foot mansion at 177 Benedict Road on Todd Hill, the highest naturally occurring point on Staten Island and the entire eastern seaboard south of Maine. Associates and FBI agents alike referred to the property as the White House. Castellano had commissioned its construction in 1976, and it took 4 years to complete. The estate featured Carrara marble in the foyer and dining room, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, an English garden, a 13-car garage, and interior appointments that rivaled any legitimate millionaire's residence in the metropolitan area. Castellano ran the family like a corporate enterprise, preferring business investments in construction, meat distribution, and labor racketeering over the street-level crime that men like Gotti and Ruggiero had practiced their entire lives. He demanded a 15% cut from his capo's earnings, an increase from the standard 10%, to sustain his lifestyle and his vision of the organization. Most importantly, Castellano enforced a prohibition against drug trafficking that Carlo Gambino had established, and that Castellano elevated to the defining policy of his administration. No member of the Gambino crime family was to deal in narcotics. The penalty for violation was death. Following Della Croce's diagnosis of terminal cancer, Castellano issued an even more explicit version of the prohibition, declaring that any member made after 1962 was forbidden from any involvement in the drug trade under pain of immediate execution. He pressured the National Commission to adopt a Mafia-wide ban carrying the same penalty. The rule was not a suggestion. It was not a guideline. It was an absolute prohibition backed by the credible promise of lethal enforcement. The arrangement might have held indefinitely if Angelo Ruggiero's younger brother had not been building something in the shadows that none of them, not the boss, not the underboss, not even the crew members who would inherit it, could control. While Angelo and Gotti were establishing their positions within the hierarchy in Ozone Park, Salvatore Ruggiero was constructing a narcotics empire that would generate millions of dollars a year and eventually destroy every person it touched, though not through the mechanism anyone expected. Salvatore was 5 years younger than Angelo, born in the same neighborhood, connected to the same uncle, but assembled from entirely different materials. Where Angelo was stocky and relentlessly loud, Salvatore was disciplined, physically fit, and capable of a silence that earned him the street name, Sal the Sphinx. He exercised regularly. He maintained a muscular build that contrasted sharply with his brother's chain-smoking, binge-eating physical decline. He married an airline stewardess named Stephanie and fathered a son, Salvatore Jr., born January 8, 1972. Angelo admired his younger brother with an intensity that bordered on awe. He tried to emulate Salvatore's criminal entrepreneurship and failed. The younger brother had something the older brother lacked: discipline. The operation Salvatore built was called the Pleasant Avenue Connection, named for its base in the Italian-American enclave of East Harlem's Pleasant Avenue, a neighborhood with roots in organized crime stretching back decades. Salvatore imported heroin primarily from Southeast Asia, routing shipments through Florida ports before distributing them through networks in New York City. He expanded beyond heroin into marijuana and cocaine, diversifying the product line in a way that maximized revenue and minimized dependence on any single supply chain. The scale was enormous. Annual revenues measured in the millions of dollars. The network he constructed would later be recognized as a direct precursor to the Pizza Connection, the massive heroin smuggling operation that used pizzerias as distribution fronts across the northeastern United States and generated over $1 billion in narcotics revenue before federal prosecutors dismantled it in the mid-1980s. Salvatore's primary supplier was a Sicilian-born Bonanno crime family, capo named Gerlando Sciascia, known on the street as George from Canada, who operated a pipeline that moved tons of heroin from Montreal into New York. The connection to the Bonanno family's Canadian operation gave Salvatore access to product at a volume and consistency that few independent operators could match. He used the profits to finance a lifestyle that included private aviation, multiple residences, and a network of associates that extended across the eastern seaboard. The problem was not the money. The problem was that every dollar Salvatore earned was a violation of the one rule that Paul Castellano enforced with the explicit promise of execution. Salvatore and Angelo maintained a careful fiction, insisting to anyone who inquired that the income was the product of successful truck, hijackings from Kennedy Airport, the same explanation they had used for years to justify earnings that bore no relationship to any legitimate or traditional criminal enterprise. Caporegime Carmine Fatico accepted a share of the heroin proceeds under this pretense, maintaining his own plausible deniability. The deception worked as long as no one investigated too closely, but the federal government was investigating, and by the late 1970s, three separate indictments had been filed against Salvatore, charging heroin trafficking, extortion, and tax evasion. Salvatore ran. He became a fugitive with the resources and the discipline to stay one step ahead of federal agents who were actively searching for him. He assumed multiple aliases and relocated across states, maintaining hideouts in Florida, Georgia, and New Jersey that were funded by the continuing revenue of a drug operation that did not stop generating income simply because its principal was wanted by the government. His primary refuge was a house in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey, a Bergin County community far enough from the streets of Brooklyn and Queens to provide distance from the neighborhoods where federal agents were most active. He stored heroin shipments in the house. He stored cash. He maintained the communications infrastructure that allowed him to manage a distribution network from a position of concealment. His wife Stephanie traveled with him, sharing the fugitive existence with a willingness that suggested she understood, at a minimum, what funded the lifestyle she was living. The operation continued to generate extraordinary profits throughout the fugitive period. Salvatore's connection to Sciascia's Montreal pipeline ensured a steady supply of product, and the distribution network he had built in New York continued to function through associates who reported to him through intermediaries. He lived as a wealthy man on the run, purchasing private air travel, maintaining multiple residences, and conducting business at a scale that most legitimate entrepreneurs would have found remarkable. Everything about his existence represented a calculated defiance of two separate authorities: the federal government, which wanted to imprison him, and the boss of his own criminal organization, who had promised to kill anyone who did what Salvatore was doing. Both threats were real. Neither stopped him. His life was a gamble sustained by discipline, secrecy, and the assumption that neither the government nor Castellano could see what he was doing clearly enough to act on it. On the morning of May 6th, 1982, Salvatore Ruggiero boarded a private jet with his wife Stephanie and two pilots, and none of them would reach their destination. The FBI's Gambino squad had been investigating Salvatore Ruggiero for months before the Learjet fell into the Atlantic, and his death did not close the investigation. It transformed it. The heroin recovered from the crash wreckage confirmed what agents had long suspected about the nature and scale of the operation, and the question became not what Salvatore had been doing, but who would continue doing it, and whether the continuation could be documented. The answer arrived within days, visible in the movements of the three men who had driven to the Franklin Lakes hideout to recover the drugs and the cash, and in the conversations that one of those men would soon be having in a house he believed was private. Among the intelligence assets the FBI's Gambino squad had cultivated over the preceding years, one was more consequential than any other, and his value derived from a proximity to the target that no undercover agent could have achieved. Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson had been a federal informant since 1966, the year he was imprisoned for armed robbery, and discovered that the criminal organization he had served with violent loyalty had failed to honor its promise to care for his family in his absence. The betrayal was formative. Johnson had grown up alongside Gotti and Ruggiero in East New York. He had been part of the Fulton Rockaway Boys. He had participated in some of the crew's most sensitive operations, including, by some accounts, involvement in the disposal of bodies and the gathering of intelligence on rival factions. He could not be made a full member of the family because of his mixed Italian and Native American heritage, a fact that denied him the protection and income that full membership provided, while requiring him to assume the same risks. The resentment generated by this structural exclusion ran deep, and the FBI exploited it with precision. Johnson's most consequential contribution was specific and tactical. He provided FBI agent Abbott with a detailed layout of Angelo Ruggiero's home. He identified the rooms where Angelo conducted meetings. He described the physical configuration of the space with enough accuracy that agents could determine exactly where to install listening devices for the most comprehensive possible coverage. Using Johnson's intelligence, the FBI installed 4 bugs and wiretaps in the Ruggiero residence. The telephone they targeted was listed in the name of Angelo's daughter, Princess Ruggiero. Angelo had told associates the phone was safe, that the FBI would not know about it. The phone was the opposite of safe. It was, as events would demonstrate, the most dangerous telephone in the history of the Gambino crime family, a direct line between Angelo Ruggiero's compulsive need to talk and the federal government's need to listen. The surveillance apparatus was in place by late 1981, and by the spring of 1982 it was recording continuously. After Salvatore's death in the crash, Angelo, John Gotti, and John Carneglia took over the heroin network he had built. They reconnected with the Gerlando Ciancia's Canadian pipeline. John Gotti and Carneglia flew to West Palm Beach, Florida to purchase heroin from one of Salvatore's former suppliers. The operation continued as though the man who had created it was still alive, with one critical difference. The man who had created it had earned the nickname the Sphinx for his ability to keep silent about what he was doing. The man who inherited it had earned the nickname Quack for his total inability to do the same. For the next several months, every word that came out of Angelo Ruggiero's mouth traveled to 2 destinations: the room he was standing in, and a set of FBI tape recorders that would eventually destroy every person whose voice appeared on them. The recorders ran for months, and what they captured was a comprehensive portrait of a criminal operation that believed it was operating without observation. Angelo Ruggiero discussed heroin trafficking in terms that left no room for ambiguity or alternative interpretation. He was recorded declaring, with an enthusiasm that the agents who monitored the tapes would later describe as remarkable for its candor, that there was a lot of profit in heroin. He discussed quantities. He discussed prices. He discussed supply routes and distribution logistics and the mechanics of converting raw product into street-level revenue. John Gotti appeared on the recordings discussing drug transactions with a directness that matched his co-defendants. John Carneglia's voice was captured in conversations about the operation's infrastructure. The evidence accumulated on magnetic tape with the steady, indifferent patience of a machine that does not tire, does not forget, and does not care about the consequences of what it records. Beyond the heroin discussions, the tapes captured something that would prove equally destructive, though through an entirely different mechanism. Angelo Ruggiero insulted Paul Castellano with the frequency and enthusiasm of a man who has been holding back for years and has finally found a room he believes is private enough to say what he truly thinks. He called the boss of the Gambino crime family a milk drinker. He called him a pansy. He dismissed Castellano's sons, who operated a legitimate poultry business called Dial Poultry, as the chicken men. He ridiculed the business advisors Castellano had surrounded himself with. He sneered at the boss's preference for white-collar commerce over traditional street rackets. Every contemptuous remark was preserved on tape. Every dismissal, every insult, every expression of the resentment that the Gotti faction felt for the man who led their family was captured and cataloged by agents who understood that the content of these recordings would eventually be heard by the very man being insulted. The tapes also captured Angelo's grief. In the weeks following Salvatore's death, the wiretaps recorded Angelo speaking with wistful emotion about his brother, linking the loss to the ongoing effort to recover heroin stashes connected to Salvatore's operations. He discussed John Gotti, locating drugs from the dead man's network. The grief and the business were intertwined on the recordings, in a way that made clear what the FBI had already deduced. The crash had not ended the heroin enterprise. It had transferred ownership from a man who knew how to keep a secret to a man who did not know how to keep anything. Agent Bruce Moole, who led the FBI's Gambino squad and who had been directing the surveillance of the Ruggiero heroin operation since its earliest stages, made a strategic calculation that reflected both the ambition and the patience of a federal investigator who understood that the recordings from Angelo's house represented an opportunity of historic proportions. Rather than arrest the men whose voices were already captured on tape, he held off, allowing the recorders to continue running while the evidence accumulated. His objective was not merely the men already on the recordings. His objective was John Gotti, the acting captain of the crew, the man whose authority had sanctioned and protected the narcotics operation, and the man whose voice, if captured on tape discussing heroin in explicit terms, would sustain a prosecution that could decapitate the most dangerous faction of the most powerful crime family in New York. The wait produced mountains of additional evidence against the men already captured on tape, but Gotti's voice never appeared in any conversation about heroin. Gotti maintained, whether from genuine organizational protocol or from an instinct for self-preservation that his associates lacked, that as acting capo, he should never visit the home of a soldier. The distinction kept his name off the drug tapes. It would not keep him safe from what the tapes set in motion. On August 8, 1983, 17 months after Salvatore Ruggiero's death in the Atlantic, the Gambino squad executed its arrests. Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, John Carneglia, their attorney, Michael Coiro, and associate Mark Ryder were taken into custody. In September of that year, a federal grand jury returned an indictment charging 13 defendants with drug racketeering and obstruction of justice. A superseding indictment filed in May of 1985 expanded the case to 16 defendants across 12 counts. The evidence was constructed almost entirely from the recordings made inside Angelo Ruggiero's home, and those recordings contained more than enough material to convict every person whose voice appeared on them. The indictment was the first detonation. The second came from inside the family, and it was worse. Paul Castellano had always equated drug dealing with death, and now he was staring at documented proof that the men closest to his most ambitious captain had been conducting precisely the business he had prohibited under penalty of execution. When the 1983 indictment became public, and Castellano learned that the entire case rested on wiretap recordings from inside a Gambino associate's home, he demanded the tapes. His reasons were twofold. He wanted to identify which members of the Gotti faction had violated the narcotics ban, information he would use to enforce the death sentence he had promised. He also needed the tapes for his own legal defense. Castellano's attorneys were preparing to challenge the government's evidence in the upcoming Mafia Commission trial, in which Castellano himself had been named as a defendant, and the Ruggiero recordings had been cited as part of the evidentiary foundation that supported additional surveillance operations, including the one that had bugged Castellano's own home. Angelo Ruggiero refused to surrender the tapes. His refusal was immediate, absolute, and grounded in arithmetic that left no room for compromise. The recordings would expose him, John Gotti, and John Carneglia as heroin traffickers, operating in direct violation of the boss's most serious edict. Under Castellano's own rules, that exposure would mean death for all three of them. The tapes would also reveal, in Angelo's own recorded voice, the catalog of insults he had directed at Castellano over the months of surveillance, contempt so explicit and sustained that it would transform a disciplinary matter into a personal vendetta. Angelo told his lawyers that he would kill them if they surrendered the recordings. He meant it. Agnello Della Croce, the underboss and Angelo's maternal uncle, attempted to mediate the crisis. He told Castellano that the tapes contained personally embarrassing material that Angelo did not want exposed. He tried to create delay, to reduce the temperature, to buy time for a resolution that did not end with the execution of his nephew and the men his nephew had been dealing drugs with. In private sessions between Angelo Gotti and Della Croce, Angelo refused to bend. He accused his own uncle of betrayal for even considering the possibility of compliance. The accusation was unfair by the standards of the organization in which the underboss owed his first allegiance to the boss, but Angelo was not operating within those standards. He was operating within the logic of a man who knew that surrendering the tapes was surrendering his life. Castellano was not placated by the delay. Knowing that the tape transcripts would tie John Gotti's crew directly to narcotics trafficking, he threatened to demote Gotti from his position as capo and reassigned the members of his crew to captains more loyal to the boss's authority. The threat was existential. If Castellano carried it out, the Gotti faction would lose its organizational protection, its income streams, and potentially the lives of its members. The tape crisis had transformed a law enforcement problem into a civil war. While the internal confrontation consumed the Gambino leadership, the FBI was using the Ruggiero recordings to build something else entirely. The evidence gathered from Angelo's home provided the legal foundation for a new surveillance operation, this time targeting Castellano himself. FBI agents had intelligence that Castellano conducted regular business meetings in the dining room of his Todd Hill mansion, the 33,000 square foot estate on Staten Island's highest point. An undercover agent was assigned to penetrate the property under a pretext. The FBI deliberately interfered with Castellano's cable television signal, cutting the connection so that the picture in the White House dining room went dark. The plan depended on a sequence of assumptions about Castellano's behavior, each of which proved accurate. Castellano, who spent most of his time in the mansion and held regular meetings in the dining room, called the cable company to request a repair. The FBI intercepted the call. An undercover agent, trained to pass as a cable television technician, arrived at the front gate of 177 Benedict Road in a company vehicle with the appropriate uniform and identification. He was admitted to the house. Inside, working on the back of the television set in the dining room where Castellano conducted business with his capos, the agent asked Thomas Bellotti, the boss's personal bodyguard and constant companion, to assist by holding a flashlight so the agent could see the internal wiring. Bellotti complied. He stood directly beside the agent, aiming the flashlight into the back of the television, while the undercover operative installed a listening device in the unit in plain view. The installation took minutes. Bellotti never suspected what was happening. The bug in the dining room of the White House would produce recordings that contributed directly to the legal cases that destroyed the boss it had been placed to surveil. The bug in Castellano's dining room produced evidence that contributed to his arrest in 1984 on charges connected to the criminal activities of Gambino hitman Roy DeMeo's crew. In 1985, a second indictment placed Castellano among the defendants in the Mafia Commission trial, the landmark federal prosecution of the leadership of all 5 New York crime families. The irony was comprehensive and devastating. The tapes from Angelo Ruggiero's house had simultaneously exposed the crew that was dealing heroin in violation of the boss's orders and provided the legal mechanism to surveil and indict the boss who had issued those orders. The same set of recordings was destroying both sides of the Gambino family's internal divide. The same man's compulsive talking was generating evidence that would eventually consume the entire organization. On December 2nd, 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. He was 71 years old. He had been diagnosed with a cancer that had spread to his brain and lungs, and his final weeks had been a period of visible decline that Angelo Ruggiero, whatever else was happening in his life, had attended with the devotion of a nephew who understood what the old man's death would mean for everyone who depended on his protection. Angelo had been a constant visitor at Della Croce's bedside during those final days, sitting with the underboss as the disease consumed him, knowing that the man's death would remove the only barrier between the Gotti faction and the consequences that Castellano had been waiting to impose. When Della Croce stopped breathing on that December morning, the organizational architecture that had held the Gambino family together through years of internal tension collapsed with him. Castellano did not attend Della Croce's wake. He did not attend the funeral. He had been absent from the underboss's bedside during the final weeks of the illness. He sent no representative and issued no statement of condolence. To the men who had served under Della Croce for years, men who had followed him out of loyalty and respect for his authority within the family, the absence was not an oversight. It was a calculated display of contempt, so complete and so public that it extinguished any remaining possibility of accommodation between the two factions. In the culture these men inhabited, The rituals surrounding death were considered inviolable. You attended the funeral of a man who had served. You paid your respects. You demonstrated through physical presence that the bonds of the organization transcended individual disputes. Castellano's refusal to participate was, in the language of that culture, an act of war declared over a coffin. He compounded the provocation within days. Bypassing every senior member of the family who had served under Della Croce, Castellano promoted Thomas Bellotti, his personal bodyguard and driver, to the position of underboss. Bellotti had no organizational standing that justified the appointment. He was not a respected captain. He was not a man whose judgment other members of the family trusted. He was Castellano's creature, and his elevation to the second most powerful position in the family was a signal that admitted no misinterpretation. Castellano intended to reorganize the Gambino family around men who owed their positions entirely to him, and the Della Croce faction, which included Gotti, Ruggiero, and every man who had operated under the dead underboss's protection, would be marginalized, demoted, or destroyed. John Gotti made his decision, and the men around him understood that it was not a decision born of ambition, but of arithmetic. The tapes were still a loaded weapon pointed at his crew. Castellano still demanded them. Della Croce's mediation was no longer available. Without a buffer between the boss's demands and the death sentences that compliance would trigger, the equation reduced to a binary. Either Castellano would use the tapes to justify the elimination of Gotti's faction, or Gotti's faction would eliminate Castellano before the tapes could be deployed. There was no third option. The men from the Bergin crew chose the second path, and they began assembling the coalition necessary to carry it out. Frank DeCicco, a Gambino captain who commanded respect from members of both the Castellano and Della Croce factions, was the critical enabler. DeCicco had maintained relationships across the family's internal divide, and his decision to support the plot against Castellano gave the conspiracy the institutional legitimacy it required. Without DeCicco, the assassination would have been an act of rebellion. With him, it could be framed as an organizational correction, a removal of a boss who had lost the confidence of the men he was supposed to lead. DeCicco provided detailed intelligence about Castellano's schedule and movements, including the date and location of an upcoming dinner meeting at which the boss would be accessible and, critically, unprotected by the full security apparatus he typically employed. A team of 4 shooters was selected and given their positions. On December 16th, 1985, at approximately 5:16 in the evening, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti arrived in a black Lincoln Town car at Sparks Steakhouse, located at 210 East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. The area was dense with rush-hour commuters and Christmas shoppers. Pedestrians filled the sidewalks. Traffic crawled through the intersections. The holiday lights were already on in the storefronts and office windows along the block. As Castellano stepped out of the passenger side of the Lincoln, 3 gunmen wearing trench coats and Russian fur hats moved toward him from positions they had taken on the sidewalk and opened fire. Castellano was struck 6 times. He collapsed beside the lamppost nearest to the restaurant's entrance. Bellotti, emerging from the driver's side, was shot 4 times before he could draw a weapon or retreat. Both men died on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant, their blood spreading across the concrete, while hundreds of bystanders scattered, and the sound of the shots echoed between the buildings. John Gotti and Sammy the Bull Gravano were parked in a sedan with tinted windows across the street from the restaurant. Gotti had communicated the order to proceed over a walkie-talkie after visually confirming that both Castellano and Bellotti were inside the arriving vehicle. Gene Gotti and John Carneglia were later identified by Gravano as having been among the shooters. Carneglia was believed to have walked up to Castellano's fallen body and fired the final shot into his head. Angelo Ruggiero had been positioned down the street with a backup team of gunmen that was never called into action. The most brazen Mafia assassination in modern American history had been carried out in the heart of Manhattan during the Christmas season by the very men whose heroin trafficking had created the crisis that made the killing necessary. Every thread of the conspiracy led back to the same point of origin. The tapes, the drugs, the dead brother's heroin business, the man who could not stop talking. The murder of Paul Castellano did not erase the tapes, and the heroin case the government had constructed from the Ruggiero recordings was still advancing through the federal court system with the methodical persistence that characterized federal organized crime prosecutions of the era. The case went to trial 3 times, and each trial revealed something about the system it was operating within. The first trial, which began in 1987 with Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, John Carneglia, and their co-defendants facing a jury in the Eastern District of New York, ended in a mistrial. The jury could not reach a verdict, and investigators subsequently uncovered evidence suggesting that at least one juror had been approached and influenced. The second trial produced the same result: another hung jury, another mistrial, another round of suspicion that Gotti, now the boss of the Gambino family, and a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to corrupt the judicial process in his own prior trials, had reached into the deliberative chamber and poisoned it. Sammy Gravano would later testify that he had personally paid a juror to secure an acquittal in a related case, and the pattern of jury tampering across multiple proceedings suggested an organizational capability that the government had not yet learned how to defeat. Gotti had urged his co-defendants to fight every charge rather than accept any form of negotiated plea, adhering to the organizational principle that no made man should ever admit guilt in a federal courtroom. Former Gambino capo Michael DiLeonardo would later describe the philosophy as a kamikaze mentality, a willingness to sacrifice the men on trial for the sake of maintaining the fiction that the organization could not be penetrated. John Gotti and Carneglia, loyal to the Gotti name and the code it represented, followed the instruction. They fought the charges through trial after trial, refusing to bend, while the evidence against them remained as devastating as it had been on the day the indictment was filed. The consequence was that the men whose voices had been captured on the Ruggiero tapes would endure the legal process not once, not twice, but 3 separate times before a verdict was finally rendered. The third trial began in 1989. On May 23rd of that year, the jury returned a verdict finding John Gotti and John Carneglia guilty of running a heroin distribution ring. On July 7th, 1989, both men were sentenced. John Gotti received 20 years on the racketeering conspiracy count, 15 years on the narcotics conspiracy count, and 15 years on the possession with intent to distribute charge, all ordered to run consecutively, for a total of 50 years in federal prison and a fine of $75,000. John Carneglia received an identical sentence, 50 years and $75,000. The 2 men who had driven to Salvatore Ruggiero's Franklin Lakes hideout on the day after the crash to recover his heroin would spend the next 3 decades in federal custody for continuing to sell it. Angelo Ruggiero was no longer a functional defendant by the time of the third trial. He had been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer that had metastasized to his brain and other organs. He underwent chemotherapy and radiation treatments that left him weakened and visibly deteriorating. In a detail that captured something essential about his relationship to reality, he announced during his treatment that he was giving up his Marlboros and switching to a recessed filter cigarette brand that he insisted, in direct contradiction of all medical evidence, would not damage his lungs. He was released on bail for the third trial, too sick to participate in his own defense in any meaningful way. His case was effectively severed from the proceeding. The evidence that convicted his co-defendants had originated in the bugs planted in his home, devices whose placement had been guided by a layout drawn from the memory of Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, a man Angelo had considered a trusted associate for more than 20 years. Angelo Ruggiero had given John Gotti everything a man in his world could give: loyalty from the time they were children, running the same streets in East New York, his willingness to participate in the McBratney killing in that Staten Island bar, the act that earned them both their formal induction, decades of service as the crew's most dependable presence, available for every task, willing to commit violence on command without hesitation. He had stood on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse with the backup team on the night the boss was killed. He had provided the meeting spaces, the communications, the personal infrastructure that Gotti's command of the crew depended on. The friendship between them was the central relationship of both men's adult lives, forged in adolescence and tested through prison sentences, through murder, through the daily discipline of operating within an organization that punished disloyalty with death. In the end, Gotti would not cross the threshold of the room where Angelo was dying. The falling out had been building since the tapes became common knowledge within the family. Gotti's fury went beyond ordinary anger into something that resembled permanent revulsion. Angelo's uncontrollable need to talk had cost the crew everything. The recordings had jeopardized every member of the Bergin faction. They had made the assassination of the family's boss unavoidable. They had generated federal prosecutions that consumed years and destroyed the crew's most capable operatives. They had handed the FBI the legal justification for surveillance operations that extended far beyond the original narcotics case, providing the evidentiary foundation for bugs in Castellano's own home and eventually in the Ravenite itself. Beyond the tapes, Angelo's unauthorized attempt to assassinate Lucchese family underboss, Anthony Casso had created an interfamily crisis that further eroded Gotti's willingness to extend protection. The hit team Angelo dispatched shot at the wrong vehicle and missed Casso entirely. Casso survived and openly called Ruggiero an idiot, a characterization that no one in either organization saw reason to contest. The botched assassination demonstrated what the tapes had already proven. Angelo Ruggiero lacked the judgment, the discipline, and the operational competence that his position in the family hierarchy required. Sammy Gravano would later testify that Gotti had considered having Angelo murdered for the cascading damage his talking had inflicted on the organization. Gravano intervened, arguing that killing a dying man served no strategic purpose and carried risks that outweighed any satisfaction the execution might provide. Instead, Gotti stripped Angelo of his rank as capo regime of the Bergin crew and severed him entirely from the family's criminal activities. The man who had stood at the center of the crew since its earliest days was excommunicated from the organization while his body was being destroyed by cancer. In the final months of Angelo's life, both Gravano and Gene Gotti urged John to visit his childhood friend. Gotti refused. The man who had talked so much that the entire government now possessed a recorded inventory of his crimes, his opinions, his loyalties, and his hatreds, died in Howard Beach, Queens, on December 4th, 1989, at the age of 49. His funeral was attended by a small number of relatives and associates. John Gotti did not attend the service. Gravano later claimed that he had to nearly drag Gotti to the wake, that the boss of the Gambino family could not bring himself to mourn the man whose voice had given the FBI the foundation for everything that was coming. Angelo Ruggiero had been dead for less than a month when the FBI planted the listening devices that would complete what his tapes had set in motion. In November of 1989, agents installed wiretaps in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy, Manhattan. The club itself was bugged. The doorway was bugged. The widow of a former Gambino soldier, whose apartment sat directly above the club, had provided the access that made the installation possible. John Gotti had constructed his entire public identity around a principle that was the precise opposite of the operational discipline that had kept other bosses alive and free for decades. He chose visibility. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club on a regular weekly schedule, arriving in tailored suits that cost thousands of dollars, greeting the photographers and reporters who assembled on the sidewalk when the boss was expected. He dined at prominent Manhattan restaurants without concern about being observed. He waved to bystanders on the street. He cultivated a media persona that treated public recognition as a source of power rather than a source of vulnerability, and his 3 successive acquittals in federal court, including a case in which a juror was later convicted of accepting a bribe, reinforced his belief that the legal system could not reach him. Each acquittal expanded the legend. The Teflon Don, the press called him, the boss nothing could stick to. The contrast with the Genovese family's leadership during the same period was total. Vincent Gigante, who commanded the Genovese organization throughout the years, Gotti led the Gambinos, wandered the streets of Greenwich Village in a torn bathrobe and slippers, pretending to be mentally incompetent, forbidding anyone in his organization from speaking his name aloud. Giganti's family survived. Gotti's family did not. Two men running the two most powerful criminal organizations in New York simultaneously, representing philosophies so opposed that the distance between them constituted a test of which approach the federal system could defeat. Silence endured. Visibility was destroyed. Gotti did not whisper. He did not communicate through intermediaries. He did not conduct sensitive conversations in bathrooms with the water running. He spoke freely, in rooms he was certain were secure, about the operational details of his criminal enterprise, including the planning and authorization of murders. The Ravenite tapes captured Gotti discussing killings, criminal strategy, and organizational decisions in his own voice and with his own vocabulary. He described the experience of hearing recordings of himself, in a moment of irony the agents monitoring the feed would have appreciated, as feeling like being violated. The recordings also captured something that no one in the Gambino hierarchy had anticipated, and that would prove to be the instrument of the organization's final destruction. Gotti, speaking to associates in what he believed was a private setting, disparaged his underboss and closest operational partner. He accused Sammy Gravano of authorizing hits without permission. He blamed Gravano for murders that Gotti himself had sanctioned. He called him greedy. He questioned his judgment. He assigned to Gravano responsibility for organizational problems that Gotti had created. The commentary was sustained and specific, and it was all recorded. In December of 1990, FBI agents and NYPD detectives arrested John Gotti at the Ravenite Social Club. He was charged with racketeering, 5 murders, including the assassinations of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti, criminal conspiracy, illegal gambling, loan sharking, bribery, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. Arrested alongside him was Sammy Gravano. The evidence included hundreds of hours of incriminating wiretap recordings. The trial judge ordered the jury to remain anonymous, identified only by number, so that neither bribery nor intimidation could reach them. For the first time in 4 federal prosecutions, the system surrounding John Gotti was one he could not corrupt. In 1991, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, and a man who had participated in 19 murders over a career that spanned more than 2 decades of organizational violence, agreed to cooperate with the federal government. The decision, which represented the most significant defection in the history of the American Mafia to that point, was driven by a specific and documented catalyst. Gravano had listened to the Ravenite tapes. He had heard the man he had killed for, the boss whose orders he had followed without question through murder after murder, disparage him on a recording that both men now knew the government possessed. Gotti had accused Gravano of authorizing hits without permission. He had blamed Gravano for killings that Gotti himself had sanctioned. He had called him greedy. He had assigned to his underboss the responsibility for organizational failures that Gotti's own decisions had produced. The accusations were not merely insulting. They were dangerous. On the tapes, Gotti was positioning Gravano to absorb criminal liability that rightfully belonged to the boss. The code that governed their world required the boss to accept that burden. The man at the top was supposed to shield the men beneath him, to absorb the risk and the responsibility that accompanied command. Gotti had violated the code in the most public and most permanent way possible, on a recording that will be played in a federal courtroom. Gravano made his calculation. The code was already broken. The man who had broken it was the man who expected Gravano to die for him. Gravano chose a different path. He broke his blood oath, entered into a cooperation agreement with the government, and admitted to involvement in 19 murders, 10 of them directly sanctioned by Gotti. His testimony at trial was precise, comprehensive, and devastating in its specificity, delivered by a man who had been present for every decision, every killing, every act of organizational authority the government needed to prove. On April 2nd, 1992, an anonymous, sequestered jury convicted John Gotti on all 13 counts, including ordering the murders of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The head of the New York FBI office observed that the Teflon Don was now covered in Velcro and every charge had stuck. John Gotti died of throat cancer in the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. The complete accounting of what one plane crash destroyed is documented and specific, and it reaches further than anyone present on the morning of May 6, 1982, could have imagined. Salvatore Ruggiero died in the crash at the age of 36, along with his wife Stephanie and two pilots, in an aircraft descending, for reasons no investigator has ever explained. Angelo Ruggiero died of terminal lung cancer at 49, stripped of his rank, abandoned by the man he had served since childhood, cut off from the organization that had defined his entire adult life. Gene Gotti received a 50-year sentence and served 29 years, released in September of 2018 at the age of 71. John Carneglia received the identical 50-year sentence and served the identical 29 years, released in June of 2018. Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, the informant whose layout of Angelo Ruggiero's home had made the wiretaps possible, had been exposed as a government cooperator in 1985 when federal prosecutor Diane Giacalone revealed his status during a public hearing in an attempt to convince him to testify against Gotti in a plea arrangement. Johnson refused to enter the witness protection program. He remained in his Brooklyn neighborhood, aware that the men he had informed on now knew what he had done. Gotti reportedly assured Johnson that he would not be harmed, but the assurance was a courtesy, not a promise. On August 29, 1988, hitmen ambushed Johnson as he walked to his car in front of his home, firing 19 rounds. He was struck in both thighs, twice in the back, and at least 6 times in the head. The murder was never officially solved. Paul Castellano, the boss of the most powerful crime family in New York City, was assassinated on a midtown sidewalk because the crisis produced by the Ruggiero tapes left the men beneath him no option they could identify other than murder. Thomas Bellotti died beside him. Frank DeCicco, the captain whose insider intelligence about Castellano's schedule had made the Sparks assassination possible, was killed by a car bomb planted beneath his vehicle on April 13, 1986, in the Dyker Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn. The bombing was ordered by Genovese boss Vincent Gigante and Lucchese boss Vittorio Amuzzo as retaliation for the unsanctioned assassination of Castellano, which had violated commission protocol by proceeding without the approval of the other family bosses. DeCicco was killed instantly. The bomb also severely injured Lucchese soldier Frank Bellino, who had been standing nearby. It was the first time a bomb had been used in a New York Mafia killing in decades, and the attack demonstrated that the consequences of the Castellano assassination, itself a consequence of the Ruggiero tape crisis, were still radiating outward months after the event. John Gotti, the most famous mob boss in American history, was convicted and sentenced to die in federal prison, destroyed by surveillance techniques and legal strategies that the FBI had developed and refined across a decade of investigation that began with 4 bugs in Angelo Ruggiero's home. Sammy Gravano, the underboss who had personally participated in 19 murders, turned government informant and served 5 years. The Gambino crime family never recovered the power it held before Gotti's conviction. The organization that had been the most influential of the 5 New York families for decades, the family that Carlo Gambino had built into an empire spanning construction, labor unions, the waterfront, and every significant criminal enterprise in the metropolitan area, was reduced to a fraction of its former capacity and authority. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, a former sanitation worker who lacked every quality that made a crime boss effective, assumed nominal leadership of the family after his brother's imprisonment, and was himself convicted of racketeering and conspiracy to murder Gravano. He received a sentence of 9.5 years. later supplemented by additional convictions that ensured he would spend the rest of his functional life in federal custody. John Gotti Jr., who had briefly served as acting boss, pleaded guilty to racketeering charges in 2001 and served approximately 6 years. The leadership pipeline that should have sustained the family for generations had been destroyed. The men who could have led were dead, imprisoned, or cooperating with the government. Sammy Gravano, whose testimony had been the decisive weapon in the government's case, entered the Witness Protection Program after serving 5 years in prison for his admitted involvement in 19 murders. His post-cooperation life did not follow the trajectory the government had hoped for. In 2000, he was arrested in Arizona for operating an ecstasy distribution ring, a narcotic enterprise that generated millions of dollars in revenue before it was dismantled. He was sentenced to 20 years and served approximately 17 before his release. The man who had destroyed the Gotti organization by cooperating with the government subsequently built and operated a drug network of his own, a circularity that defied every narrative of redemption the cooperation agreement was supposed to represent. The Genovese family, which had operated throughout the same era under a philosophy of absolute invisibility and organizational silence, survived with its structure and influence largely intact. The FBI assessed the Genovese organization as the most powerful, sophisticated, and secretive of the five families well into the 21st century. Two organizations, operating in the same city, during the same decades, under the same federal pressure, produced opposite outcomes. The one that chose silence endured. The one that harbored a man who could not stop talking was dismantled from within. The chain of causation is unbroken, and it runs in a single direction. A fugitive heroin trafficker built an empire that violated his boss's most sacred prohibition. He died in a plane crash off the coast of Georgia. His brother inherited the business and the federal investigation that accompanied it. The FBI used a childhood friend's betrayal to place listening devices inside that brother's home. The devices captured heroin transactions and insults directed at the family's leader. The recordings led to indictments that threatened the crew with destruction from both directions simultaneously, from the federal government and from their own boss. The tape crisis eliminated the possibility of peaceful coexistence within the family and made the assassination of the boss a matter of survival. The assassination elevated a man who operated without the discipline that survival in his position required. The FBI, using the methods and legal foundations developed through the Ruggiero investigation, penetrated his headquarters and recorded his most damaging conversations. Those recordings drove his underboss to betray him. The betrayal produced a conviction. The conviction produced a life sentence. The life sentence produced a death in federal custody, all of it traceable through an unbroken sequence of documented cause and effect to a single event. A Learjet falling from clear sky into the Atlantic Ocean, 12 miles southeast of Savannah, Georgia, on a morning in May of 1982. The crash itself was accidental in every way that the National Transportation Safety Board could measure. No sabotage, no mechanical malfunction, no pilot error that investigators could identify or reconstruct, no weather event, no structural failure, no fuel contamination, no navigational confusion. An aircraft descending from the altitude at which it was designed to fly without explanation, without communication, without any recoverable indication of what went wrong, until it struck the surface of the Atlantic Ocean and killed everyone inside. The cause remains officially undetermined, a classification that means, in the precise and unforgiving language of federal aviation investigation, that no human being has been able to establish why it happened, and that the likelihood of ever establishing an explanation has diminished with each passing year until it has effectively reached zero. The Learjet that carried Salvatore Ruggiero into the water will never surrender its secret, but the destruction that followed the crash was neither accidental nor unexplainable. It was the predictable and perhaps inevitable consequence of placing the most sensitive business a criminal organization could conduct in the hands of a man who treated every room he entered as a confessional and every telephone he picked up as an invitation to share everything he knew. Angelo Ruggiero did not intend to destroy the Gotti crew. He intended to honor his dead brother's memory by continuing the work Salvatore had built. He intended to earn the money the heroin operation generated. He intended to maintain the loyalty and the friendships that had defined his life since he was a boy in Brooklyn. He simply could not do any of it in silence. And in the world he inhabited, silence was not one virtue among many. It was the only virtue that mattered. The Learjet that Salvatore Ruggiero boarded on the morning of May 6th, 1982, fell from the sky for reasons no one has determined. The organization that fell after it fell for a reason that everyone who survived could see clearly, though only after it was too late to do anything about it. A man who could not stop talking, embedded at the center of an enterprise that could only survive in silence. The ending was already written in the architecture of that contradiction. It just took a decade to reach the final page.